Okay, well, again, welcome to week 2 of Bunsen burners, beakers, and Bibles at the intersection of science and faith. And tonight, we're going to take on our second topic, a short history of science. Last week, we covered God's 2 books. And in fact, this second topic is closely tied to topics 3 and 4. Last week, I introduced the idea that there are really 2 key ideas I'm going after in this class. One is that God has written 2 books for us, His Word and His works. And we were just discussing that in the last few minutes here. Tonight, we're going to start the process of looking at the second key idea, that Christian thought played a key role in the birth of science as we know it today. And in fact, these next 3 topics, 2, 3, and 4, are kind of joined in the hip. They flow one to the other. And it's going to lead us to this topic number 4, which I've called history's puzzle. You've seen this term in my outline for the class. So I think tonight's a good time to introduce history's puzzle. And this is what I mean. I'm going to use the words of Dr. Alvin Plantinga for this. Dr. Plantinga is, in my view, one of the most accomplished Christian philosophers of our day. And I thought he described the puzzle better than I could in my own words. So I'm going to use his words. He said, modern science came to full bloom only once in human history. That bloom occurred in Western Europe, which was immersed in Christian theism. None of the preceding great civilizations had succeeded in this. Not the golden age of Greece, not the Chinese, not Islam. So that, in my view, is the puzzle. Why did modern science emerge then, 17th century? Why there? Western Europe. And we're going to take these next 3 class sessions, and I'm going to walk us through that. And I hope convince you that how this happened, why then, and why there. All right, give me just a moment to change my slideshow and share a different set of slides with you, which is right here. So tonight, a short history of science. And we're going to take basically the same tour that Dr. Plantinga outlined for us. We're going to look briefly at ancient Greece, at China, at the golden age of Islam, and finally 17th century Europe. Pardon me. Now, the word science comes from a Latin word, scientia. And the simplest translation of that Latin word is knowledge. So when we're speaking of science, it's knowledge of the natural world. And obviously, for centuries, for thousands of years, humans have been seeking that knowledge. As we go through these next 3 class sessions, I'll gradually introduce the idea that modern science in Europe in the 17th century was centered around a new method for obtaining knowledge about nature. So I'll open that up as we go along. But for now, let's start in the golden age of ancient Greece. And we're going to take a rather quick tour through many centuries of the history of science. So this map is ancient Greece in the year 475 BC. And I think you'll recognize the peninsula where the modern day nation of Greece exists. And the dark brown areas surrounding the Aegean Sea, this is all Greek culture, Greek-speaking people, even the island of Crete here in the south. So it completely encircles the Aegean Sea, even up here to the site of modern-day Istanbul and the waterway coming down from the Black Sea. That was Greek-speaking in this era. And two towns are really important. We're going to talk about several of the giants of the golden age of ancient Greece who were based in Athens. And we're also going to talk briefly about some philosophers in the town of Miletus, which is over here on the west coast of modern day Turkey. Well, I think by most accounts, the four giants of the Greek golden age were these four individuals. First of all, Socrates, who tutored Plato, who in turn was a tutor to Aristotle, who tutored Alexander the Great. Now, starting with Socrates, he was certainly a thinker and a very insightful and provocative individual, but he didn't write anything. He was not an author, and nothing has passed down directly from Socrates. Plato is second on our list. He was a prolific writer, and it's believed that his entire body of work has survived intact to our day. It was Plato who wrote about Socrates and how we have come to know Socrates. One philosopher has written about Plato. The best description of European philosophy is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. So Plato's philosophical ideas have had great influence and covered a lot of territory. Next is Aristotle. He made enormous contributions to the Greek Golden Age, as well as to all of Western civilization that followed in the centuries after. I'm going to talk about Aristotle on the next slide. The fourth guy is Alexander the Great. My goodness, what a remarkable guy. By the age of 30, he had created one of the largest empires in history. Alexander was never defeated in battle. He's still considered one of the greatest military commanders of all time. And the regions he conquered were greatly influenced by Greek culture. So here's a quick look. This is the territory that Alexander conquered. He started here in Greece. He conquered all of what was the ancient Persian Empire, sort of in this region. He went down into Egypt, conquered all of the Nile Valley and a little ways west beyond. Alexander also ventured deep into Asia. Excuse me. In fact, right over here, this eastern edge of his empire is the Indus River. That's the modern day boundary between Pakistan and India. He went that far east. He conquered all, I believe, of what is modern day Afghanistan, and his empire reached up into Central Asia. So again, one of the biggest empires in the world in its day. Because of the incredible influence that Greek culture had, influence on architecture, art, monetary system, the use of coins, philosophy, and language. Greek influence is still evident in these parts of the world, even today. And the Greek language was spoken all around the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. It's no accident that the New Testament, written 3 centuries later, 4 centuries later, was written in Greek, because that was the predominant culture of the Eastern Mediterranean. And we have Alexander to recognize for that. Pretty amazing what he accomplished. By the age of 30, and by the age of 33, he died. Just remarkable what he accomplished. Well, let me return now to Aristotle. Of the 4 giants of the Greek Golden Age, he may be the most influential. He exerted unique influence on almost every form of knowledge in the West, even though only about 1/3 of what he originally wrote has survived to our day. His key contributions, in my view, were in logic, the rules of reasoning, and in philosophy. And he wrote about all kinds of topics in philosophy. Aristotle made contributions in numerous other areas: physics, astronomy, mathematics, biology, agriculture, medicine, poetry. I'll let you read the rest of the list. He dabbled in pretty much every area of human civilization. He was a master of many different topics. And Aristotle's work was not widely known in Europe through the Middle Ages, but was reintroduced after the year 1200. And Europeans were fascinated with his writings, his philosophy. In the following centuries, every university in Europe taught Aristotle. After the 13th century and later, if you were an educated person in Europe, you had studied Aristotle. In addition to the individuals like Plato, Aristotle, Alexander, here's some of the remarkable innovations of the golden age of ancient Greece. This is a pretty short summary, but I think these things were pretty remarkable, so I've included them in my summary. The ancient Greeks gave us the 2-dimensional geometry taught in high schools still today. I had a high school geometry class. I'm guessing all of you did. We basically were being taught the geometry developed by Euclid, who lived in the mid-4th to mid-3rd century BC. His work was based on Aristotle's logic, and his book, Elements, translated into Latin, was used as a main textbook in Europe, believe it or not, into the early 20th century. Absolutely remarkable that not only his geometry, but even the book he wrote was being used for over 2,000 years. Really incredible. Another thing I find fascinating is the ancient Greeks gave us the earliest known sun in the center model of the solar system. This was left to us by a guy named Aristarchus in the 3rd century BC. This is notable because Aristotle taught the opposite. He taught that the Earth was the center of our solar system. And that was the predominant idea that came into Europe. But it wasn't the only concept of the solar system. Aristarchus had the idea that the sun was in the center 200 years BC, worth knowing about. Another guy I found particularly interesting is Eratosthenes, 2nd century, well, 3rd into the 2nd century BC. He made the earliest known estimate of the size of the Earth. Really remarkable. Based on measurements he made, and his value was within 2% of the accepted value of the size of the Earth today. Truly remarkable accomplishment. And to make his measurements, he was assuming that the Earth was round. His method absolutely required that the Earth be a sphere. So he was not a flat earther there in the 2nd century BC. He knew the Earth was a sphere. And finally, the earliest known idea of the atom comes from the 5th century BC, a guy named Leucippus. His idea was that all matter is composed entirely of tiny individual particles, which turned out to be correct. In fact, the word atom in the English language comes from a Greek word. So there were some amazing accomplishments, amazing insights during the golden age of ancient Greece. One more set of philosophers I want to highlight, and these 3 guys were called the Milesian philosophers, whereas Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were all based in Athens. These guys were over there on the eastern side of the Aegean Sea in the town of Miletus. They are Thales, who tutored Anaximander, who tutored Anaximenes. Now, what was unique about these philosophers is they broke from the use of mythology to explain the world. Instead of explaining natural objects and phenomena instead, they explain natural objects and phenomena by naturalistic explanations. They are one of the earliest thinkers who went in this direction. It was much more common in the ancient world to see spiritual meanings behind natural events, to see the gods at work in storms and lightning bolts and so on. But the Milesian philosophers took a different approach and began to think in terms of naturalistic causes, naturalistic explanations. Clearly a precursor to the modern scientific method today. Pretty interesting. Well, given all these accomplishments, we might ask the question, why did the golden age of ancient Greece not give us modern science? Why did modern science not emerge at that time? The golden age of ancient Greece was like a fire that burned brightly, but then faded and burned down, eventually glowing embers, eventually dying out. It was a great explosion of discovery and new ideas, innovation, but the progress didn't continue. And so the question is why? In fact, we might have expected with the seed planted by these Milesian philosophers that something like modern science might have emerged. But in fact, the Milesian philosophers did not carry the day. There was lots of competition, lots of different views of the world, which were not so friendly to science. And here are a few of those competing ideas that I've come through in my study. We can start with Pythagoras, very early, 6th century. He steered Greek philosophy away from observation of nature and toward mysticism. That is, things like intuition, introspection, religious experience, even mathematics was considered a mystical thing. He was much more interested in mysticism than observing nature. He felt like that was the more valuable focus of study. And Pythagoras was very influential in this Greek Golden Age. Plato went in a similar direction. To Plato, the ultimate reality was the ideal forms that existed only in the spiritual realm. So knowledge was to be found through divine insight, intuition, and reasoning, not so much from observation of nature. Again, Plato was incredibly influential. He really went in a different direction than the Milesian philosophers had in mind. Another competing philosophy, or another theme in the Greek Golden Age, I think is what I'll say, is that Greek thought was inadequate to provide conviction of a law-abiding universe, or even the existence of a law-giving creator. First of all, the Greek gods were not all-powerful. They all had powers, but their own areas of influence in the natural world. None of them were all-powerful. And furthermore, in Greek thought, the universe itself was eternal, not created. So it wasn't natural to think that there was a law-giving creator back at the beginning who laid out laws of nature that defined how nature operates. So the idea that the universe was eternal is a real key difference. And a final thing I'll highlight is that the Greeks thought of heavenly bodies, sun, moon, the stars, etc., as living things, having aims, emotions, and desires. So the Greeks, when they studied the heavens, they were more likely to look for motives than for laws of nature. So there were a lot of competing ideas, a lot of ideas that took the golden age of ancient Greece in some other directions. And eventually the progress and the pursuit of knowledge that bloomed so brightly in ancient Greece, it kind of faded away slowly. Now I'm going to move to the second civilization on our list, and that's China. Here's a map of China in the 9th century. China was a really innovative civilization. And when I read about the accomplishments of China, it's these 4 great innovations that are front and center. These 4 inventions, paper making, printing, the compass, and gunpowder, are celebrated in Chinese culture for their historical significance. And each of these inventions really made enormous changes in human civilization. For instance, the combination of paper making and printing, it changed literature, communication, information, dissemination of information, storage of information. Just a quantum leap in reduction in cost and copying things to many people in different parts of the nation, parts of the world. The compass changed how we sail the oceans and explore the world. And gunpowder, obviously, it changed warfare in significant ways. I remember watching the opening ceremony to the Beijing Summer Olympics in 2008. I don't know if any of you watched the same ceremony, but those opening ceremonies for the Olympics are almost always an occasion for the host country to share their culture with the rest of the world. And the theme of that opening Olympic ceremony in 2008 was exactly these 4 inventions. They used these inventions, and that was the theme of the ceremony, the music, the dance. It was pretty incredible. That's how central to Chinese culture and identity these inventions are held to be. those weren't the only things China accomplished. Here's a long list of other accomplishments that apparently happened first in China. Porcelain, weaving of silk, pretty amazing, from the silk from the cocoon of caterpillars. Matches, dry docks for repairing ships, piston pumps for pumping water, cast iron, the iron plow, the horse collar, the stirrup, the list goes on. Just all kinds of inventions and innovations. In fact, historians agree that China held the world's leading position in many fields of knowledge of nature from 100 BC until 1500 AD. So over many centuries, they were among the leaders and the most innovative cultures. The pace of progress in China is interesting because it was slow and steady over many years. It wasn't at all like the Greek Golden Age, where you had a couple centuries with this great outpouring of writing and invention and new ideas. It was kind of slow and steady. So we can ask ourselves the same question that we asked about Greece. Why did modern science not emerge in ancient China? And in fact, the great inventiveness and the technologies that the Chinese had, it didn't seem to lead to a deeper knowledge as to why those inventions worked and what were the, how was nature functioning in the background. That just didn't seem to emerge in China. It's been this topic has been addressed by a lot of historians and philosophers and so on. And there's a lot of ideas proposed that the political climate in China didn't nurture science, or the legal system, the way society was organized, economic factors. So there's a lot of ideas out there, but there is some consensus, at least, that religion and philosophy were most important, highly important. One author, Rodney Stark, put it this way: Chinese intellectuals prided themselves in following godless religions in which the supernatural is thought to be a governing essence or a principle that is impersonal, remote, and definitely not a being. Now, this idea about the supernatural is pretty foreign to us in the West, where we're deeply immersed in Judeo-Christian thought, monotheism, the idea of a personal God. But in China, that was not at all the case. And consequently, in China, they pursued enlightenment, not explanations. A lot of similarities, in a sense, to ancient Greece. Pursuit of understanding of the supernatural realm and the mystical was a higher priority than observations of nature. To think a little bit more about this, I want to introduce Dr. Joseph Needham. Needham was a scientist at Cambridge in the early 20th century. And he became the 20th century Europe's foremost expert in the history of Chinese science and technology. When he was studying in Cambridge in the 1930s, he met some students from China who had traveled all the way to England to study at Cambridge. He was fascinated by their country, their culture, their language. He taught himself Mandarin Chinese. He proposed to the British government that there should be a scholarly liaison to the universities in China. he got that approved, and he got himself appointed to be the primary representative. He ended up traveling in China in the 30s and in the 1940s during World War II, traveled in China, created academic, scholarly contact with a lot of the schools in China, met a lot of the Chinese scientists and intellectuals of the day, created a lot of friendships and relationships. He brought back enormous volumes of Chinese literature, especially on the history of China, the history of science, the history of technology. In fact, his books ended up being a dedicated library at Cambridge that is still there to this day. It's one of the most detailed libraries of Chinese literature in the West. And Needham spent a lot of time thinking about the progress that China made, but why science didn't emerge there. And one author said that Needham concluded that the failure of the Chinese to develop science was due to their religion, to the inability of Chinese intellectuals to believe in the existence of laws of nature. And because, in Needham's own words, the conception of a divine celestial lawgiver imposing laws on nature never developed. In addition, Needham said the steady progress in China during many centuries was violently overtaken, interesting choice of words, violently overtaken by the exponential growth of modern science in Europe. So that, in my view, is, I think, the clearest explanation of why ancient China didn't give birth to modern science. Let's switch now to the third civilization in our tour, and that's the Golden Age of Islam. Pardon me. And the Golden Age of Islam is typically taken to be these 5 centuries, from the 8th to the 13th centuries. And in this period, a new dynasty came to power, the Abbasid dynasty, specifically from 1750 to 1258. And just 12 years after they took power, they decided to build a new capital city. The old capital city was Damascus in modern day Syria, but they went to some empty land along the Tigris River, and they built a brand new city from scratch, which became Baghdad, their new capital city. Here's a map of the Abbasid Empire in the middle 9th century, about 100 years after they took power. And I've labeled both Damascus and Baghdad. So their empire was the entire Arabian Peninsula, but also this part of the Middle East, the old Persian Empire, extending east into present-day Afghanistan, Central Asia, and much of North Africa. I should mention that this part of North Africa was also Islamic, as was Spain. In fact, the Islamic dynasty before the Abbasids was the Umayyads. And the Umayyads, the remnant of the Umayyad Empire, continued to rule in Spain for some time. But we're going to focus on the Abbasid Empire. They had a 500-year rule. It was a relatively peaceful time in Islam. It was very prosperous, and they accomplished a great deal, and which gave rise to the description of the Islamic Golden Age. And here's a few of the things that took place. First of all, in just a few decades, Baghdad became the largest city in the world. That's pretty remarkable. starting from scratch in 762, Baghdad became the largest city in the world, and Baghdad was the home of an institution known as the House of Wisdom. It flourished especially in the first half of the 9th century. Now, what was the House of Wisdom? We aren't entirely sure today. It appears it was an academy of learning, probably a gathering of many scholars. It may well have been a library. It may have been an observatory. It may have been all those things. It was founded by the Caliph Al-Ma'mun, who's been described as the greatest patron of science in the long history of Islamic rulers. In addition to the House of Wisdom, the other remarkable thing that happened during the Abbasid rule is that they gathered thousands of books of wisdom and knowledge from other empires and cultures, and they translated them into Arabic. And this was truly a remarkable accomplishment. They went to ancient Greece. They got the writings of all the philosophers I've already described tonight: Aristotle, Plato, Archimedes, Euclid, Pythagoras, all of them. They found people who could translate that Greek writing into Arabic. And they added those translations to their libraries. They got the wisdom of ancient Egypt and Persia. They went to India. They brought in knowledge from China. It was an ambitious translation project. It went on for 200 years. One Islamic historian said it had no precedent in the history of the Middle East or of the world. It was an astounding achievement with profound consequences for world civilization. That's one of the key accomplishments of the Golden Age of Islam. There were also notable scholars, more than I can talk about tonight. I decided to list this dozen names. I'm going to talk about the contributions of a few of these guys, but there's more that I could include in this presentation. If you're curious, look these names up. Google for these names. Look them up on Wikipedia. Their accomplishments are just really amazing. Philosophy, algebra, trigonometry, the mathematics of triangles, astronomy, medicine, chemistry, and geography, optics, and more. There were just all kinds of original contributions, new ideas coming forth during this Islamic golden era. And here are a few that impressed me the most. The Golden Age of Islam gave us a medical textbook used in Europe until the year 1800. That book was written by Avicenna around the year 1000, and it was still being used in Europe 800 years later. Just amazing. The Golden Age of Islam gave us a mathematics textbook used in Europe for 400 years. It was written by a guy, Al-Khwarizmi, easy for me to say. It's got the impressive name, translated to English, the Compendious Book on Calculation by Completion and Balancing. Gotta love the title. The Arabic word for completion became the English word algebra. Guys, this is where algebra came from Al-Khwarizmi, about the year 1000. If you like algebra, you can give him credit. If you really didn't like algebra back in school, you can blame him. Another accomplishment of the Golden Age of Islam was in the area of mathematics. In fact, I've got to give credit to Hindu mathematicians, because by the 7th century, Hindu mathematicians in India had developed a numbering system with two unique features. It had 10 numerals, including a 0. Keep in mind, the Roman numerals didn't have a 0. They didn't have that at all. They just started at 1, but the concept of a 0 wasn't there. The Hindu mathematicians, their new system also had place value depending on position. We're all familiar with this, how numbers have the ones place, the tens place, the hundreds place, and so on. As best as historians can tell, this was the first time in history that these two ideas had been put together in a mathematical system, both a 0 and the place value notation that we're familiar with. Well, during the golden age of Islam, when Islamic scholars visited India, they found this system and they realized it quite quickly how superior it was to any of the mathematical systems in use. They brought it back to the Abbasid Empire. And in fact, it appears that al-Khwarizmi himself created the shapes of these 10 characters, these 10 digits that we use for numbers today. I think al-Khwarizmi actually gave them the shape that we still use today. When I went to school, these were called Arabic numerals, but several references I looked at in the last couple of years refer to these numbers as Hindu Arabic numerals, correctly giving credit to their origin in India. Couple other significant accomplishments I'll highlight, and then we'll move on. And those two accomplishments were another measurement of the size of the Earth. A guy named al-Biruni did this about the year 1000. He used an entirely different method than Eratosthenes had centuries earlier. I don't know whether al-Biruni was aware of Eratosthenes' measurement. He might have been, but al-Biruni used a whole different method, and by some accounts, he was within 2% of today's accepted value. Unfortunately, al-Biruni's unit of measure was cubits, and we don't know exactly how long the cubit was in his day. But I will note that the method al-Biruni used assumed that the Earth was round. Again, there was no question about the Earth being flat. He knew the Earth was a sphere. Another notable accomplishment is that there were proponents of what we would call a scientific method. It appears by an author, Al-Hazen, in his book of optics, where he argued that a hypothesis must be supported by experiments under controlled conditions and by mathematics to describe the events, what's being observed. This idea also appears in the writings of Avicenna and al-Biruni. So this is interesting. Again, we have this idea of hypothesis, experimentation emerging. So given these many accomplishments in the golden age of Islam, we can ask ourselves for the third time, why did modern science not emerge in the golden age of Islam? And in fact, the golden age of Islam was a bit like Greece. It bloomed and burned brightly for many centuries, but slowly the light dimmed and went out almost altogether. It certainly lost momentum. And one Islamic historian said, by the time of the so-called scientific revolution in Western Europe, Islam's scientific star had set in the Middle East. So again, why was it a golden age, and why did the progress slow? Why did the progress fade? And again, there might be multiple reasons, but here are a couple that seem most prominent to me. On February 10th, in the year 1258, the city of Baghdad, the capital of the empire, fell to Mongol invaders from Central Asia. Most of the inhabitants of the city were massacred or enslaved. It was a brutal event. Reportedly, 36 cities in the city. Who knew that this capital city had 36 libraries? 36 libraries reportedly were vandalized and their contents dumped in the Tigris River. A pretty ugly ending. The fall of Baghdad was, in effect, the end of the Abbasid Empire. There were some Abbasid rulers after this, but they were much less powerful. They controlled much smaller areas. It wasn't an enormous empire as it had been for 500 years. Now, I noted in the West, there was also an Islamic presence outside the Abbasid Empire, but the areas in Spain held by Islam were gradually, excuse me, gradually being reconquered by Catholic armies. In fact, Cordoba fell to the Spanish reconquest in the year 1236, just a few decades from the fall of Baghdad. Seville in Spain fell in 1248. So this 13th century was a period where some of the major centers of scholarly expertise in Islam were being conquered and taken over by invaders. And that had to have a real effect on the ongoing scholarly progress. There were other things happening within Islam too that turned out to be very, very important. In particular, there was a competing philosophy within Islam to that idea of hypothesis and experiment and so on. Just the whole focused study of nature. And that competing philosophy begins with a theologian, al-Ash'ari, in the late 9th, early 10th century, and his theology was named Asharite theology, named after him. Asharite theology had its place, but it didn't become widely influential until a century later, when a guy named Al-Ghazali advocated for Asharite theology so successfully that it became the dominant form of thought in Islamic culture. And see, this is happening in the 11th to early 12th century, when Asharite theology became the most dominant point of view. In fact, it has survived to our day. It's known as Sunni Muslim belief. Al-Ghazali was the author of a work called The Incoherence of Philosophy. Gotta love that title. The Incoherence of Philosophy, which itself was a philosophical essay. You have to wonder about a title like that. His essay criticized Greek philosophy. Now, given the translation work that Islam had done, the works of Plato and Aristotle were of great interest to the scholars. But Al-Ghazali is critical of that, and he favored faith over reason as the primary source of knowledge, or I should say Asharite theology. argued for faith over reason as the primary source of knowledge. And let's take a closer look at that. Asherite theology is, I can't describe the whole thing, but here are 4 important elements that stood out to me. Number 1, the preeminent source of knowledge is the Quran. It places the Quran in the preeminent position as a source of knowledge. Human reason or philosophy has its place, but only in second place to the Quran. In this way, Islam, several commentators note that Islam has failed to reconcile faith and reason. And that's had a long-running effect on Islam. In addition, Asherite theology promoted a philosophy called occasionalism. Don't stumble over the term. And don't try to figure out what it means just from the word occasionalism. It's just a label. But here's a couple things that it means. Occasionalism denies cause and effect in nature because Asherite theology believes Allah is the direct and immediate cause of everything we observe in nature. That is a really key idea. Consequently, there are no laws of nature. In fact, the idea that there would be laws of nature would restrict Allah's freedom to act. One, Al-Ghazali himself said it would put God in handcuffs. This was a really bizarre idea for me to get my head around when I first began to read about it. But this idea of occasionalism, in effect, is saying that, say, when we've got a June thunder shower here in Golden, we think of the raindrops condensing in the cloud because it's too humid and the cloud is cool, and you get raindrops forming, and then gravity takes over and the drops fall to earth, and some of them land on the grass in my lawn. But according to occasionalism within Islamic thought, the raindrop doesn't form because of condensation or temperature change. It forms because Allah directs it. The raindrop doesn't fall to earth because of gravity. It's because Allah directs the raindrop to travel in that direction. And furthermore, Allah decides exactly which raindrop falls on which blade of grass on my front lawn. That's what this idea of occasionalism is all about. I think the consequences of this have been very serious. And I can illustrate that through introducing you to this man, Pakistani physicist, Dr. Abdus Salam. He was a 20th century physicist, perhaps the greatest Muslim scientist of the 20th century. In fact, he shared the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1979. What's most notable about his winning the prize is that even today, this is still the only Nobel Prize awarded to any scientist from an Islamic country. Dr. Salam, in his time, did what he could to promote interest in science. He wanted to promote the scientific renaissance among his people, but largely without his success. In his own words, of all civilizations on this planet, science is weakest in the lands of Islam. And in my view, this is one of the tragic consequences of Asherite theology and the philosophy called occasionalism. All right, that closes my discussion of the golden age of Islam, and it brings us into 17th century Europe. And I'm going to stop here for the evening. It's just a couple minutes after 8 o'clock. Our time is up. And I'm going to pick up right here next week, next Monday night, and we'll talk. I'll give you a brief history of how modern science emerged in 17th century Europe.